some of the people on the front lines of work at the local community level to interrupt cycles of violence and address root causes, and how this relates to our lobbying work and the work that we're doing with Congress. So we're very excited about this. I'm particularly excited to talk more with Jose about our visit and to share this with you all and to have some discussion with you about it. When I came to FCNL and learned more about what was underway with the violence interrupters and how we were lobbying for this work, it really reminded me so much of the work that local people are doing all around the world on the front lines of conflict and violence and local peace building work that has been a big part of my life. So it was a real humbling and also an honor to have this visit with Jose and learn more about the work. So I want to just share a quote from FCNL's The World We Seek policy statement to help orient us to this program work and how it relates to our overall mission in the world. We call for a transformation of our current system of criminal justice, which today is used principally as an instrument of retribution, a policy contrary to our Quaker belief in the possibility of redemption, and which leads to mass incarceration. We advocate for crime prevention that recognize the complex and pervasive causes of crime, which often are rooted in social and economic justice. We're going to be talking today about some of those alternatives and those remarkable people who are leading the work in communities to transform how we deal with crime and promote justice. So, Jose, we had an amazing trip to Baltimore last month, and I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that trip and what it was all about.
Sure. There was one story that for me really captures the nuance, importance, and the ins and outs of violence interruption. One of the key violence interrupters in Baltimore noticed that there was a conflict and the parties got in their car. I wish she was with me to share this story because she would know all the relationships and illustrate the story with much better than I can, but I'll try my best. The people involved started driving, and after the violence interrupter investigated further, she got to know friends and acquaintances of the involved parties that drove off. She found out that the conflict was headed to Philadelphia. She worked her connections and eventually got in touch with a Philadelphia violence interrupter who was nearby where the situation was about to escalate. She got on the phone with the violence interrupter she got on the phone with the violence interrupter, and she was literally talking in his ear as he was talking to the person who left Baltimore. She was sharing information with the Philadelphia violence interrupter to talk about the party in question, ask about, just telling him, coaching him, ask about his mom, how's she doing, how about his friend. They worked together to talk the young man down. That day, that young man traveled from Baltimore to Philadelphia, and he planned to kill another young man, over $386. They eventually resolved the dispute with a payment of $300, and the violence was averted before it even started. A young man could have lost his life over $386, were it not for the resourcefulness and quick thinking of this Baltimore violence interrupter.
Yeah, I remember that story too, Jose. It was really powerful, and hearing the people who've been directly involved in that was really striking. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about who are these violence interrupters? What is this program about, particularly for folks who might be learning about it for the first time? How does this work?
The Violence Interrupters program is about taking people who, being just as involved, society has stigmatized, and employing their lived experiences as an asset in solving and reducing violence in communities. They know their neighbors, families, their struggles, and lived experiences. They are trusted and mediate between people who society has often forgotten. Violence interrupters stop violence, even murders, before they happen. They operate at great risk to their well-being and safety. Historical trauma and violence exist in the urban settings where they serve. We owe them a great debt of gratitude, but their work isn't known enough and certainly doesn't receive enough funding.
So what is Congress's role in all of this? Of course, FCNL's focus is always about lobbying Congress. So how is that relevant for what we do and what our grassroots network can be doing?
The funding streams can get complicated, but the implementation of the program is simple yet powerful. Congress has a role in advancing the violence interruption program. They can dedicate funds in appropriations bills. Again, these have the force of law in funding the government, and the budget is a framework. So it's good to remember that. For violence interrupters, to give communities the resources they need, the Department of Justice makes grants to states that then fund it down into communities to hire violence interrupters. But this funding in the past has been inconsistent in some organizations that hire violence interrupters. And there have been instances where operations have had to run with no funding at all for months. This initiative needs continuity and to be expanded to be effective at the scale we need to make communities more peaceful. Let me give you some numbers to help you understand. The typical violence interrupter makes approximately $40,000 to $45,000 a year. That's a little more than a college graduate entering the nonprofit sector and starting their career. There have been violence interrupters literally gunned down in the course of their work. It is very, very dangerous work. They're saving lives, and the pay is not commensurate with the work they're doing. So we have the issue that there aren't enough violence interrupters, and the ones who are serving their communities risk their lives are not getting paid enough. We can do better by dedicating the funds, compensating violence interrupters adequately, and scaling up this powerfully effective program. We are moving in the right direction. Early on in the formulation of the Build Back Better legislation, President Biden called for $5 billion to be dedicated to, quote, community violence intervention, or CVI. This would have funded violence interrupters. In the last government funding bill, again, an appropriations bill, the FY22 omnibus CVI saw $50 million in funding. Although this will benefit violence interruption programs across the country, there is discretion. And interest in violence interrupters could wane in favor of more police presence, for instance. We need to call for dedicated funds for violence interrupters so this important program can be scaled up and continue to do the good work in communities that we're seeing across the country.
Yeah, I remember actually being pleasantly surprised to hear President Biden in the State of the Union actually mention community violence interrupters. And this is actually work that you began months ago. Congress knows very little about, but obviously has this really critical role around the funding in. So it seems like there's a real opportunity here. I want to point out that Imani's going to post a link into the chat for an action page on an action you can take to raise this issue more with your Congress people.
So I also do want to add about the president's remarks. He, I believe, called them trusted messengers. So there are a number of different names that you might hear from violence interrupters. Oftentimes we hear credible messengers, sometimes trusted messenger, outreach worker. They essentially do the same thing. Here in Baltimore specifically, they use them as stepping stools, like promotions. You can start off as an outreach worker, and then you become a violence interrupter, and then you can become a site supervisor. So there are a lot of different names, but essentially they do the same thing. Now, Bridget, you've done a lot of work in this area as well. Can you talk about that?
Sure. As I mentioned, I was really excited to see FCNL starting to take up this work on figuring out how to promote and support what I think of as local peace builders from my background and the work I've done previously with local peace builders around the world. this is very similar to what we hear and see with communities in conflict in other places around the world, who are often under-recognized and under-supported, and yet are doing the frontline work of actually interrupting violence in the moment, sort of the first responders, and then understand best the community's needs and how to address the root causes of the conflicts behind the violence. So, I had the honor for many years working with Peace Direct, and in previous work, also with Quakers previously, of learning from local peace builders like this around the world. And then discovering in the last few years that this isn't just work that we need urgently more and more in our own communities in the US, but actually it's work that's underway. There are these programs around the country. There are people doing this work, and they're very often unseen and unheard. And yet, one of the lessons I certainly learned from local peace builders around the world was that local people know best. Local people understand the problems that their communities are facing. They are best placed to lead the solutions that their communities need. And yet often they're not receiving the attention and resources that they need. So I think this is really similar and relevant to my own experience, and certainly sitting with those community leaders and listening to their stories of directly intervening in moments of violence, and of the trust, as you mentioned, the trust that they've built with their communities. It's really relevant to how peace building is not just something that happens far off in other places where conflict is underway. It's something that happens right here in our own communities, and then we can be supporting, and that actually policymakers, decision makers in Washington, Congress, and appropriators need to be supporting more. So it really is, I think, a reflection of understanding that this work is here and all around the world. So I just also wanted to pick up on the trip that we were taking to Baltimore. And it was such a remarkable discussion, Jose, and sort of experiencing and learning from those violence interrupters there in your own community. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what were some of the big key takeaways for you from that conversation?
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying some of the things that I brought into the conversation that folks in the room already knew, but sometimes we don't talk about enough. There's economic disinvestment in these communities. There's over-policing in these communities where people are harassed because it's assumed that they committed a crime because of the community that they're in. There's racism that exists in American society, and people are carrying that with them, and that trauma sometimes gets transmitted forward. There's conflict that happens between people, that's natural. And people who have, like I was saying, been economically disinvestment in those communities, there is the informal sector. There's sale of drugs, and these transactions aren't something that you negotiate out in court. So sometimes those conflicts spill out into the streets. And that is a reality in some of these communities. And we had a really great meeting with the organization that hires violence interrupters in Baltimore, which is Safe Streets. And I just want to share some of the quotes that really just, after hearing that framing that I just gave, I hope will stick with you as well, like it stuck with me. One was, the site supervisor said to me towards the close of our discussion, there's more death out here than there is money. These communities have been dealing with a lot, and oftentimes you'll see that death is just treated as a normal cause of life. Violence is a normal cause of life. It's a norm, and you see that more than the economic investment that you see in these communities. And that phrase for me really stuck with me. Another one was violence interruption only works because interrupters are their own experts. Like Bridget was saying, these communities know best and they know how to resolve their disputes. They know how to handle the problems that they face day in and day out. And we just have to trust them enough to solve those problems and help them to help themselves, essentially. Violence looks different from city to city. You can't compare Kansas City to Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York. You just can't do it. We ask violence interrupters who come from trauma to go back out there and face that trauma over and over. It's true. Like I was saying, violence is a norm in some of these communities, and violence interrupters have been proximate to that violence practically their entire life. Violence interrupters not only are members of the community where there is violence, but they also travel into the center of that violence every single day. This is traumatizing. A violence interrupter shared with me that she hugged a 19-year-old boy who had a high capacity firearm clip. And she asked him, do you have a bulletproof vest on? She asked more questions. Do you know that he's the person who rolled on you? It turns out that it wasn't. This young man could have sprayed bullets on a street targeting the wrong person in a conflict that could have ended deadly. But because of her, it didn't escalate into violence. This violence interrupter has heard in her neighborhood, don't shoot nobody if you see an orange shirt. Safe streets workers wear orange shirts. It's not just the mediation they provide, but they are also a calming presence, and just really go show you how important their work is. Now, Bridget, were there things that stood out to you from our meeting?
Yeah, there were. I mean, I think that some of the stories you've highlighted, Jose, certainly stick with me. And just the demonstration of commitment of these community leaders, I think was quite remarkable. I remember, I think one of the violence interrupters said he'd been at this for 14 years, maybe, was it? A very long time, and yet continuing to, as you say, go back out into these very difficult situations. And the commitment also of training others. They were very clearly working to build a team, to help support the team. There's a whole training program that they talked about, and to build resilience amongst themselves and in their communities, as a way of both dealing with the direct, immediate violence that they're confronting on the streets when they're called into a specific situation, but also as a way of thinking about building resilience in the community to address long-term root causes. So their bravery really stood out to me. I also remember we asked them at one point about their relationship with the police. And I recall, they kind of acknowledged, well, there can be some information sharing and potential coordination at times, but really they said, we need to keep our distance from the police, because actually being directly associated with the police can undermine their legitimacy and their work and that critical trust that they've built with the communities. So that just really struck me as, part of the way that they have to navigate the situations in their community, and also their understanding of their unique particular role that they're playing to prevent violence that is different than traditional policing and needs to be treated differently. And I also remember them talking about wraparound services and really talking about their work as part of an ecosystem of support and resilience building that communities need to be safe and healthy. So they really understood their work was not going to solve all the problems. It was, not the only thing that was needed. In fact, it was one piece of a whole ecosystem of mental health services, of, as you said, addressing economic injustice and marginalization of the community, and really trying to build a system in which violence prevention is one piece of broader peace building, as I would call it. So it was really struck me that they clearly saw that. And at the same time, they're, as you said, they're under-resourced. They can only do a certain amount in their communities. So they're really not able to build that whole ecosystem yet right now. And I think this really struck me as similar to what I've seen with local peace builders in other places, where they really understand the intersection of issues and the intersection of how they need to build peace and longer term justice in their communities. So those were some of the things that really stayed with me as important takeaways, particularly thinking about, making the case for these programs within Congress and for the funding that's needed for them. And I also understand, Jose, and wonder if you could talk about how the program in Baltimore is actually one program of many across the country, and maybe tell us a little bit more about what's happening on a national level with this program.
Absolutely right. Let me start with Baltimore. To give you some context, Baltimore and Washington, D.C. have similar population sizes. Washington, D.C. is 68 square miles, and Baltimore is quite a bit bigger at roughly 92 square miles. And I think that the population sizes are about 670,000 people in Washington, D.C., and about 620,000 people in Baltimore. The Safe Streets Violence Interrupters in Baltimore only cover 3% of the city. There are other violence interrupter programs in operation in Baltimore, but Safe Streets is probably the most established. The problem is very large, and this innovative and effective solution is underutilized where they are needed most. The federal government makes grants across the country, usually to states, who partner to fund cities that engage nonprofit organizations that either run or partner with other organizations that pay and employ violence interrupters. This is all pretty complicated, but that's because government needs hyper-local operations, like Bridget was saying, to be effective. Like I said before, a violence interrupter's ability to connect with someone's aunt, their birthday, their little brother's basketball game, or just how their best friend is doing in an impromptu conversation on the block is how they harness the power of their relationships and the credibility of their life experience to address conflict before it escalates into violence or from spilling out into more violence after an event.
Great. Thank you so much, Jose. You've learned a lot about the details of how this all works. And I know we're getting some questions already in the chat to learn more about it, which is great. And also some resources that are being shared, which is really appreciated. So I wanted to turn it over to Imani now to take some Q&A with the audience.
Thanks, Bridget. So our first question was from, make sure that was the first question. I don't want to skip everyone. Yeah, so our first question was from Elizabeth Beavers. It was, I'm curious if you all have seen any risks of being an interrupter programs being co-opted for surveillance or law enforcement or other potentially harmful purposes, and or what sort of oversight protects against that? Sorry. Yeah.
Wow, good question. So I can really only speak to the programs that I've met with and talked to. So mainly Baltimore, DC, and I've looked at some literature about the New York City interrupters as well. And there really is a robust firewall that keeps law enforcement away from violence interrupters. Sometimes this can cause some friction because law enforcement want to solve crimes, and if there's information known that's related to a crime, they want to know about it. And sometimes interrupters are privy to information that happens in the community. But from the conversation I've had, I haven't seen any co-opting about surveillance on community members. I know here in Baltimore, there's a separation between the violence interrupters in government because the main source of funding is city government here in Baltimore, and they fund Catholic charities, which then is the fiscal agent and runs the program Safe Streets here in Baltimore. So there's also that buffer between violence interrupters and government in that way. And yeah, so that's what I've seen. I thankfully I haven't seen them used for surveillance. So that's good news.
Great, thank you, Jose. Our next question comes from Karen Putney, who says, so violence interrupters is a description for people with a certain skill set and commitment. It is not an organization. How would one identify who is doing this work in their city? Where does the training come from?
On the first part, you're right. There is no violence interrupter organization. I believe there's an association that helps to organize violence interrupters, but it acts more as a trade group than a organization that hires and operates violence interruption programs. As far as the training, I believe that there's training that violence interrupters have to go through. Each operation is different. One of the main schools of thought that serves as the sort of the underpinnings of violence interruption, which is not perfect. It's called the Cure Violence model that comes out of Chicago. And it basically says that violence can be a disease that transmits from person to person. And so in interrupting the violence, you try to stop it. You try to stop that disease from spreading. Obviously, that's can be viewed as problematic because then you're basically calling Black people in urban communities diseased. So it's not a perfect model, but it's one that's used. Yeah, and like I said, there is training, but it differs from location to location.
I might just jump in also and say, on how do you identify who is doing this work in their city? It's interesting that in different cities, Jose, if I'm right, some of these programs run through the actual city government. Washington, D.C. is structured like that. Some are more independent. And so it is really locally led in that sense and locally determined how things are designed and how the training develops. But the model that you mentioned, the international model of Cure Violence, one of the, I think, positive things about it is that it's made to be adaptable. So it's actually designed so that local communities can take it and then design it themselves, how to respond to the needs of their community, which makes it more difficult, as you've said, to actually track and understand everything that's happening, but also more effective from a local perspective.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Jose. Our next question is from Bill Wars. Are violent interrupter programs a source of employment for formerly incarcerated people? The difficulty in finding work after incarceration is a real problem in most communities.
Great question. And short answer is yes. The longer answer is, like I was saying, it takes people who have been stigmatized, who are oftentimes people of color, who have difficulty finding employment sometimes. It takes that for which they have been stigmatized and viewed as less than, and makes that into a strength and uses that to create peace in communities because they're credible. They've had the same life experience of the people who have been, who are at high risk of committing violence. But it is not permanent employment. This is high burnout work. It's very dangerous. And the hope is that you can transition away from violence interruption after a number of years, maybe 5 to 6 years, and then be gainfully employed doing something that's more sustainable, that's not so taxing on your mental health and your physical and emotional well-being. And then other people who are just as involved, who have a criminal record, can come in, be trained, and do this work, and make communities more peaceful by stopping either violence or retaliation from happening. But yeah, that's a great question.
So our next question comes from Shell Gross. In Madison, the VI organization also functions as an alternative to police officers for non-criminal quality of life 911 calls, such as ongoing noise complaints, where mediation or connection to social services are more appropriate than tickets or arrests. Is this a role that groups have in other communities?
I actually hadn't heard of this. This is a really great use of violence interrupters. We've seen, and activists have been saying for years that we have been growing and growing and growing the size of the police budget, and other areas of government that serve us have been either shrinking or staying the same size. And police officers are asked to do too much, and they respond to too many different calls. So I think this is a great use of violence interrupters. It obviously would require more training and probably more professionalization of the operation, I think. But yeah, this is actually the first time that I've heard of this, but this is a pretty good use of violence interrupters.
It's great to know that so many people in our community are already familiar with violence interrupters, it sounds like, in their own communities. I don't think there's another question right now burning from the group, so I wanted to jump in and ask one, Jose, which is, what does Congress think about all this? You've been, talking about these programs with Hill offices. What do they know about it? What is their response to it?
Really great point of opportunity here. Unfortunately, they have not heard a lot. This in the past has been funded out of different pockets of funding that's available from the Department of Justice. There isn't a lot of knowledge around violence interrupters, and what I can tell you is that I am getting ready and anticipating some negative positions, let's call them. So there's this thinking that you commit a crime, you do the time, very simplified maxim of like, you do something bad, you're going to jail. And there isn't a lot of, I think, robust understanding of the root causes of where crime originates. And that in order to make communities more peaceful, force isn't always the answer, which is another way of saying war is not the answer. So I think with certain offices, they're going to be of the mind that the only response to crime is police. And that's where we have to be ready to talk about historical trauma, to talk about economic disinvestment in certain communities where people oftentimes feel that their only option is drugs and selling drugs, or addiction. You just fall prey to addiction and you use drugs and you need help, not incarceration. So we just have to be really nuanced in how we approach those conversations, because there are going to be people in Congress who are opposed to this because they're going to be thinking that it's not only spending money that we should just be using for police, or we're spending money on criminals. And that's something that we have to be ready for as well. And I think that's why we are so uniquely positioned to do this work, because there's that of God in everyone. There's that of God in people who are who are victim of crime, as well as there's that of God in people who are committing those crimes. And we have to address with both sides of that equation. And the violence interrupters are a much more effective solution to stopping violence and murders from happening before they even begin with. And police usually respond to it after something bad has happened. So let's make communities more peaceful and stop before it even starts.
That's great. And I think it reflects a comment there in the chat box that Karen put in about being proactive and getting upstream, that preventive approach. This has been such a great conversation, and it really strikes me also that our community seems to have a lot of great experience, knowledge, maybe some direct engagement in their communities, or at least understanding of how violence interrupters are working in their communities, which also, of course, means you all have great stories to share with Congress about this and help educate them. So it's been really encouraging for me to see all the comments and resources being shared in the chat box through all of this as well. I don't think I see more burning questions, but I don't want to close off conversation. If there's any last minute conversation or any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box there. If not, maybe I'll just turn to Jose for final thoughts. Anything else that you want to emphasize? There is a comment or a question about, were 3 safe street folks killed in Baltimore? Looks like it's a question. Do we know, Jose?
I actually have not read the news, so I'm not sure. But I hope not. Yeah.
Deirdre, if you have more information on that, please feel free to share it. We'd certainly want to know. And I know Jose continues to be engaged with Baltimore Safe Streets, not recently. Oh, a Baltimore Sun article. Okay, thank you. I know they talked about in our visit that, some people have been killed in the work that they do. Thank you very much. There's the article, so folks can check this out too. Great. So any final thoughts, Jose, last words of encouragement or action for folks to take?
Yes, here's where you come in. We need you to reach out to your senators and lift up the work of violence interrupters. You'd be surprised. A lot of staff on Capitol Hill haven't heard of violence interrupters. Ask them to dedicate federal funding for violence interrupters. One big takeaway is that violence and crime overall have root causes. We can harness the wisdom and experience from the community to mediate violence within the community without furthering mass incarceration. And thank you so much for everything that you do and will do.
Thank you, Jose. So please do write, call, visit with your members of Congress on this issue. Thank you all so much for being here with us on a Tuesday afternoon. Thank you for all your support and engagement with FCNL, for your advocacy and lobbying and your financial support and your spiritual support. We could not do this without you. So thank you so much.